She was our holiday brunch speaker last year, amazing. She is the director of the Bliss Institute at Akron U, and so we're kind of doing like where democracy was, where it is in our country, and kind of doing a kind of then and now. So without further ado, Dr. Strong, welcome to the stage.
It's really nice to be back. Part of the Bliss Institute's mission is to provide civic and political engagement opportunities and education, not just for our students on campus, but for the community. So you're helping me live up to the Bliss Institute's mission by inviting me back, so I really appreciate it. So I was thinking about what to say today and thinking about the conversations that I've been having with students and community members around Akron, and I'm going to try to roll this into how we got here, sort of to understand where we are and how we got here, but then also signs that I think, either specific ways or signs that I think show optimism or a path forward. So I always try to not leave people with it's the holiday season, we don't want to be too depressed. I want to leave you with where we might go. Not a promise that everything will work, but where we might go to try to start to fix things. But I think it's really hard to fix a problem unless you understand how we got here. So why are we so polarized? And how did we get to the point where the polarization is trumping democratic norms? So, right? Where we're so committed to the faction, or some people, enough people, that it's become a problem. That there used to be this notion that there was legitimate opposition and you might really dislike what the other side was doing, but there were democratic norms of things that we understood you had to toe the line on those things in order, even if you didn't like who was currently in charge or you didn't like the policies that were being enacted, the way to address that was to maintain the democratic norms and live to fight another day. There's another election around the corner, and we've become so polarized and so factionalized that people see the other side winning as the end of Western culture, put the words in that you've heard people say, the end of Western culture, the end of this, the end of that, to the point where they're willing now to sacrifice democratic norms, right, in order to continue to win, in order to fix and rig the game so that they can continue to win. So how did we get to the point where we are so polarized that seems like the right thing to do or the right path to take? So I want to take a step back with you and go, why do politicians need people to vote? Why would they bother turning us into a faction? Right? Why? Because it is at the elite level that this has been done over 50 or 60 years. Right? This is a long-term process. So I'd just like to think about, with me, take a step back and go, why do people, in a democratic system, people wield power in elections and they need people to show up and vote? Why did people ever vote in the first place? And so there's a really good scholar who wrote a book called Why We Vote, a guy from David Campbell from Notre Dame. And if you can just envision with me a U-shaped curve. I didn't want to bring a PowerPoint. We can imagine a U-shaped curve, right? I don't need a picture of it. I hate technology. So if you envision with me a U-shaped curve, and you can put Tocqueville on the right and you can put Madison on the left. These are the reasons why people vote at high levels. It's very, we didn't need political science. We had early political observers tell us why. Tocqueville, who came here, and made the tour as a French bureaucrat to try to better understand what was happening in America, to sort of predict how things would play out in France. So he came in the 1800s, and he said, people vote in America because they have an intrinsic sense of civic identity. They have habits they have what he referred to as democratic norms, or habits of the heart. They have self-interest rightly understood. And they just seem to understand and know that they have to being involved in, you got up and came here this morning instead of doing something else. You're involved in philanthropy and voter registration drives and the work of the public, because you understand that those are sacrifices that you are personally making with your time, sacrifices that you're personally making, from your energy. You could be an entrepreneur, you could be home with your family, you could be doing something that's more hedonistic than showing up and listening to me talk, right? But Americans, he said, had a cultural norm of civic virtue. He said not really civic virtue because we did it out of a sense of self-interest. That we really had a sense of self-interest rightly understood, that we had to maintain a democracy, and that the only way we were going to continue to live in a democracy is if we collectively made these kinds of sacrifices. Right? So when people have that, you'll vote for dog catcher, right? You'll read the newspaper about the most boring public meeting to understand the budget for a local school board, right? You will do the boring, mundane things, and democracy works best when it's boring, right? When it's a committee meeting about how we're gonna spend the budget, right? And it's about this instead of this. And when people have that intrinsic sense, which they learn through these kinds of organizations, right? Where have Americans historically learned? Tocqueville said voluntary associations are the schools of democracy. So where are people learning that self-interest rightly? It wasn't by coming to college, right? Because going to college really happened for more Americans after the GI Bill and after World War II. It was really just very few elites, right, in the 1800s that were going to Mary and William on the East Coast, right? Not a lot of college going. So they were learning it from community norms, and they were learning it through organizations like the League or Daughters of the American Revolution or Elks, Kiwanis, those kinds of voluntary associations is where they were learning it. And so people will vote at very, very high levels when they have that intrinsic identity. If you don't have that intrinsic identity, and Tocqueville predicted this and said the biggest risk, other than slavery, he has a couple chapters on slavery, which he said, how are you going to unwind this, right? In order to have a real democracy. But he said, other than that, the real risk to American democracy is our embrace. We practiced community really well, but we celebrated rugged individualism. And you have a stable, successful democracy for long enough, and people believe they're self-made men, right? they believe that if you take rugged individualism to its natural extreme, you say, I did this all myself, right? I worked hard, I built, and so what do I owe back to anyone? And culturally, you can become very selfish when you celebrate rugged individualism. And he said Americans would become distracted from their public obligation and their public duty because there's all kinds of life, liberty, and happiness. That's not a committee meeting, right? That's being an entrepreneur and making more money and buying a bigger house and sending my kids to college and maybe playing a video game or sleeping in on Saturday morning or going shopping, right? It's doing all the other things that we have freedom to do. And you can't force people. It's not a democracy anymore if we force you to do these things. You have to do them because they are part of the culture and part of what we teach each new generation. Okay, so if you don't have that, think about that U-shaped curve. You hit a nadir, right? People are off doing their own things. And Tocqueville said power loves a vacuum. And when you're not paying attention because you're all busy doing your own thing and not doing the work of a good citizen, there's still, government wields resources, government makes decisions, government gives tax breaks, right? There's corruption to be had if no one's paying attention that can really line people's pockets. Someone's gonna still wanna wield power, but if the rest of us are not creating, right, the civic watchdog, someone else will take over. He said a tyrant will take over in the United States because the rest of us are busy enjoying our lives. Okay, so when that declines, and it has declined generationally, you hit a nadir of public engagement. There was, I'm going to blank, I didn't write the exact date down. There was an election where 18 to 29-year-olds voting, it was a midterm election, dropped to 14%. It was like about 20 years ago. And then they started doing voter registration drives on college campuses. I'm like, oh no, that's not gonna work. So you hit a nadir, but politicians still need to win an election, right? Like, this is the system that we have in place. They can't just walk in the door and go, I'm dictator now. They still have to win elections to wield power, right? So if you need to get votes when people aren't paying attention and showing up on their own, then you drive them. It's how do you fix, we'll talk about that in a minute, but how do you fix and re-bolster civic identity? It's generational, it's gonna take a while, right? That's long game. Short game is, I have an election in 3 months, how do I drive enough people to the polls? And so politicians, when American civic identity eroded and voting rates dropped, went with the other tactic, which Madison describes in Federalist Number 10, which is we all love a faction. It is woven into our identity to want, human nature, to want to identify with people who are similar and like ourselves, and to treat others like an outgroup, and to compete with them, right, for resources. And so if you convince people that politics and the goodies to be awarded through the political process, or the, whatever it is that they're controlling, is a zero-sum game, and if you don't win the game, the other people will win, and they will take away what would otherwise be yours. You can drive people to participate in politics out of fear, right? And turn them into a faction. And you're never gonna not, even at the time Tocqueville was writing, where he was praising Americans, right, for having self-interest rightly understood and good democratic habits, there was still factionalism, right? There were still people who participated. And if we threaten you enough, or you feel threatened enough, we'll all go that way. We'll all go, wait, no more taxes, or I can't pay my bills if you do that. Like, there's a point where we all sort of embrace self-interest, right? And so it's not like it's been a mix, right? But you have to have enough weight on the side of the scale where people are participating out of civic identity to balance it out. We are completely out of balance now. The erosion of civic identity started with the erosion of participation in clubs and groups and organization. Participating in an organized public sphere starts to really be visibly eroded by the 1970s. That's the place where historically Americans got civic identity. And so politicians then, starting by like the 1960s and 1970s in particular, then started to really engage in fear-mongering, negative, it's always been there, right? But they leveled it up. Fear-mongering, negative politics, fear the other side. Each new election with another scary, right, be afraid wedge issue to drive up the vote so that they could win elections. At the same time that the voluntary associations are declining and civic identity is eroding, politicians also got their hand on communication technology and computer databases. So not only can they rely on those fear tactics, which probably politicians to some extent have done that forever, but the communication technology and the access to computers made them able to do it incredibly efficiently, right? They can not only send you really, right now the technology is so good for advertising and pop-up ads. If you're using your smartphone and have the location tracker, which mine's turned on because I just used it to drive here, right? So if you're using, they can track where you're going because we've all hit cookies, accept, whatever. They can track what billboards you've driven past and use it to shape which pop-up ads come up when you go on, to read the newspaper or send some emails, right? It is that sophisticated. So they're like layering and reinforcing. They can buy all the lists or track all your cookies and know which particular hot button issue is gonna scare the crap out of you, right? And so it's just become much, much more sophisticated. There's always been a little bit of both, but there were enough Americans with civic identity to keep us in balance up through at least the 1970s. Politicians really, really take advantage of not investing in the long game, not investing in, okay, people aren't wanting to vote in our elections anymore. What have we done wrong? Why are we not passing this on to the next generation? and instead focused on the short term and used really scary election tactics and campaign tactics to drive us to the polls so that they could win elections. Political scientists call it party sorting. It sounds pretty benign, right? But they've sorted people into factions now, with all these wedge issues and all these fear tactics for 50 or 60 years. This is where we are right now is the culmination of 50 to 60 years of really aggressive negative campaign tactics, and the erosion of the public sphere, right? Which sounds really bad, and we're seeing the effects that, I mean, you can read Tocqueville, those handful of chapters from Tocqueville, and be like, how prosaic, right? Like, he said this was gonna happen. On the other hand, as I tell my students after I do this part, okay, when they go, oh, well, you know, like, it's lost, it's gone, like, we won't be able to ever get it back. And I'm like, whoa, wait a second. Okay, you still have, even if it's imperfect right now, you still have a right of association. We still have rule of law, even though it's, right, we feel like it's under threat or under challenge, but people are still filing lawsuits, people are still, right, making claims around constitutional rights, people are still, I give the example of, if you founded a political organization in your community tomorrow, or tried to run for president or governor, would someone poison your underwear drawer? Because that's what happened to Navalny in Russia, right? Like, would someone actually, I have former, I don't get to talk to them anymore, but I did have some friends who were in the opposition party. Our ability to talk to each other is now much more limited, but I had friends who were in the opposition party in Russia, and there would be days that there were protests, and GRU would knock on their door and say, don't show up today or you'll be in jail, right? And so you haven't hit those levels. And it may be hard to organize, and it may be hard to do the things. If you want examples of how people have surpassed hardship in order to do those things, I would suggest talking to an older African American woman who remembers the civil organizing and the civil rights movement, right? It's not that we've never faced these kinds of circumstances in the United States and succeeded before, right? It's just that we thought we were past it. Right? It's just that we thought we were past it. And within living memory, there are people, right? I had the luxury of having an older African-American woman in my class where I was talking about this with my students, and the students were all, and I'm not saying things aren't hard for young people. I feel like I'm one of the last ones that got through with reasonable student loan debt and the ability to buy a house, right? And do all the things, because I'm 55. So I'm not saying things aren't harder right now in terms of those metrics for young people, but they were like, it's so hard, we're not getting paid, we're this, we're that, like, oh, we can't do it. And this woman just looked at them and said, someone killed my uncle for trying to vote. Like, what are you talking about, right? Like, has anyone burned a cross in your front yard and threatened to kill you because you were voting? Right? Like, figure it out. And African Americans in the South under Jim Crow did work 80 hours a week and had substandard housing and did all kinds of hard things, and still managed to leverage the right of association and to get the right to vote and to fix things. And I didn't have to give them a lecture. She did, she gave them a little scolding, like, so it's hard, figure it out, right? Like, do you want your democracy or not? And so one of the things that I think is reassuring is people are right now in the United States leveraging their right of association, their right to free speech. There is more disruptive politics, and we don't see it because the media is not necessarily always covering it, and the way that it happened during the last Trump administration was much more visible because it was in DC. But there is more disruptive politics happening right now in the United States, exponentially more than there was in 2017. There was a really good piece in The Guardian by a scholar named Solnit, Rebecca Solnit. She's the one that invented the term mansplaining. She had a piece in The Guardian sort of outlining, it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, outlining all the things that are happening, right? Where people are leveraging their right of association. And I would point out leveraging their right of association to, in the right ways, There's a really good book called Civil Disobedience, What Everyone Needs to Know by a scholar named Chenoweth at Harvard. And Chenoweth studied other countries. And how do you topple a dictator, and how do you push back against authoritarianism? Huge databases of what tactics were successful, not only in toppling an authoritarian regime, but in establishing a democracy afterwards. It's people power. It does not come, we want to glamorize the French Revolution. We want to glamorize the American Revolution. These are rare instances of success establishing a democracy after military engagement, because typically what happens after a military coup is a general takes over and says, no civil rights and no elections because I need stability. And then you lose democracy. People who gain power through violence rule through violence, right? If you have to organize lots and lots of people to engage in enough disruption, so that your ideas have traction, your preferences, your solutions have traction, you are training lots and lots of, you're rebuilding this organized public sphere, right? If you can't, you've got to lay down organized groups with a federated structure preferably, in order to successfully, coordinate people's behavior. Disruptive politics isn't always just showing up for a rally or a march. It might be a boycott, it might be a boycott, it might be staying away from certain public places, like not riding the buses, in Selma. It might be avoiding, public places and costing people money because you refuse to go there and use that service anymore. It might be showing up in droves. Sometimes people in other countries have done things like, they were mad at the utility companies. They all turned their lights off for 2 hours in the afternoon. Cost them a bunch of money, right? It might be, refusing to go certain places and pulling back from public life in a coordinated way to boycott certain kinds of activities. You can't coordinate that kind of strategy without deliberation and organization and voluntary associations in an organized public sphere, right? So by rebuilding that kind of coordinated activity, you're rebuilding an organized public sphere that Tocqueville says you need to cultivate intrinsic civic identity, teaching people a hard lesson about how important it is for everyone to show up and do this much, collectively. The other thing is when you rely on nonviolence, it is much more inclusive. If you rely on a violent protest, I'm going to peek out my window at it. I'm not showing up. I've got a kid, I've got a husband, I like my life, right? If it's violent, you're going to get largely young men, who are angry and upset and violent, and the elderly, people with children, women, are people with stable middle-class lives are not going to show up and risk, getting arrested and that kind of stuff. And so it makes it much more inclusive, and you can pull in lots and lots more people. And you're teaching people the tactics that you need for future leaders. Right? Where do people learn how to give speeches? Where do people learn how to organize enough people to show up for an event or to coordinate their behavior collectively? That also looks like a get out the vote drive, right? That's also the kind of mobilization you need. So you look at when this has happened in the past in the United States, and you get John Lewis, right? Or more recently, you get Cori Bush, right? Out of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I would look to those kinds of activities are a sign of optimism, that people haven't given up and they are pushing back against things that they perceive as a violation of democratic norms, a violation of civil rights, and a violation of the rule of law, and they're making a point about it. And overtly, putting on the frog costumes, and the inflatables is brilliant. Because you can't be violent when you're in an inflatable. Right? Brilliant tactic to demonstrate to people that we are just here to make a point, not to throw bricks, right? The other thing that I see as a sign of that's very positive is that this is happening now, not just we're gonna all show up in DC and there'll be one march and it'll be over with. This is happening at the local level and at the state level. And honestly, federalism right now is a place to build right, is a place to build those civic leaders who you need to step up and do more, right? There are pockets of places where you can win elections. There are pockets in states where you can win at the state level, right? And that's where people, and you can control a lot of public policy that affects people's lives, right? At the state and local level in the United States. But you can also train a whole deep bench of people who are going to know how to run for office and be civic and political leaders and have all of these deep skills that we need. So the fact that Indivisible, for example, is doing this not just as a huge march in DC, but it's happening all over in pockets all over the place that are really hard for the media to cover unless you're looking at your local newspaper, is probably a good thing. And then the other thing that I would offer up, so relaying down a layer. I hope that that's what's happening. I'm not saying it's inevitable. I'm not promising anything. I'm saying like what I'm observing as a political scientist. The kinds of activities that are happening look like what Chenoweth would say are laying down this infrastructure that we need to sustain democracy long term. We need people to reconnect in these kinds. We need an organized public sphere that puts this overlapping organized layer between us and government, right? So that we can protect ourselves. And so I see that happening. I see it happening in peaceful. It's really important that it's peaceful, nonviolent. I see it happening in ways that are inviting and inclusive. And those are all the things Chenoweth says that we should do. I see them happening at the state and local level, which I think is important to actually pull people in and so that it's not political hobbyism and that they're watching it happen in DC. And the other thing that the state and local level, and why that's really important, is that the other place, if we're not going to learn it in the public sphere, right, how to be a good public citizen and how to rebolster civic identity, the other place that we have an opportunity to do it is through public education. And there was a real move, that it was like a perfect storm, man. There was a real move to push out real training for civics, not just a history class, but real training for civics, which used to exist much more prominently in the United States prior to like the 1970s and 80s. It got displaced by standardized testing, right? It got displaced by, my husband's a math teacher, so I put my thumb on the scale, like I do have a little bias on this issue, but you know, when you're gonna lose teachers or budgets because your kids can't pass a standardized test, you're gonna pull the civics class where they're developing a civics project to get a stop sign in front of their school, right? Where they're learning how government works and stepping in and learning how to be efficient and effective. And you're gonna make them study for algebra, right? So that they can pass a test. And so a lot of those more interactive service learning, you know, really active student government associations in high school got gutted. At the same time that they were losing the junior, the junior league kind of experiences because their parents stopped taking them. And so there is a movement right now to put those things back, right? I have a colleague that works at Georgetown. She runs a civic education research lab. She gets grants and partners with K through 12 teachers, and they do these kinds of, like, it's called Project Citizen. And she's providing the assessment to show that it works, and then to make the argument to put it back, you know, to persuade more governors and more state legislators to put it back. Ohio is doing this. I'm going to be a judge in January in Columbus for student projects all over the state for Project Citizen. So we can put things back in K through 12. There's also a huge movement right now to put these kinds of experiences back at college and university level, right? So the Bliss Institute is incorporating a lot of that kind of training. Before I stepped in as director, the primary focus was helping people learn how to work for parties and run for office, which we also need. But there was less focus on actual citizenship, right? What are the skills of citizenship? And so we are layering and embedding that into the curriculum and into the experiences that our students have at the University of Akron. And that's what I take when I go to conferences. That's the papers that I take, that's the pitch that I give, that's the panels that I'm on, so that it's not just going to happen at the University of Akron, that people are going to mimic the best practices that we identify, and they will be spread across the United States. And there's a huge movement with college level university presidents and provosts signing compacts to say, we're going to step up and we're going to hire faculty or give faculty space and time to do this kind of work. So those are the places that I see optimism. I'm not saying that it's going to work and that it's perfect, but I do see that people are trying really hard to leverage the resources that they have left, both for disruptive politics and for education. And the long-term goal has to be to get generations of people back that have intrinsic identity and places to show up and exercise, right, their care for their community, not just at a time to vote, but right all year long, right? So fingers crossed. I'm happy to answer questions if you have. Do you want me to answer questions?
Thank you. Could you expand a little bit on self-interest properly understood?
Yeah.
What does properly understood mean, at least as you see it?
Yeah. Self-interest properly understood means that you have to make small sacrifices, and you have to expect other people to make small sacrifices to make the collective work, right? So self-interest, rightly understood, is even in a neighborhood, me maintaining my property and my yard so that property values don't decline, but it only works if we collectively all do it in my neighborhood, right? So shaming your neighbors when they don't cut their grass, right, is part of expecting them to be a good citizen, right? So the same goes for maybe I don't want to read a newspaper every day. Well, you know what? You should. Right? I'm going to read a newspaper, maybe not completely every day, but often enough that I'm an informed citizen, and you expect other people to do it too. I'm going to show up at organizations like this and give of my time and energy, because it's the only, you can be a completely selfish person, and we can all decide to be completely selfish people, and if we do, we will not live in a democracy for very long. So getting people to understand that.
Any women with questions?
How is capitalism leading to the decline of democracy?
So one of the things that, you can go all the way back to, Aristotle and Plato, if you want, and read about when they described what it would require to maintain a democracy and why it was so hard. You have to have a broad middle class, right? In order for us to feel like we have shared fate and to have this trust that other people are gonna be in the same boat with us and do the same work with us, you can't have huge levels of income inequality. Not that there can't be not that meritocracy can't lead to some differences, right? There can be people, doctors and, people that invest in long-term professional degrees can still make more money. It doesn't have to be perfectly equal, but you can't have such huge gaps in income inequality because it's too easy to buy the system, right? It's too easy to buy yourself out of rule of law and make it not apply to you. And so unregulated capitalism leads to inevitably, right, people engage, when they have enough money to buy out the system. Political economists refer to it as rent seeking. You control the system or have enough legislators who are there because you funded their campaigns, that they pass laws that help you build up monopolies. And then when you can do that, it doesn't matter. The rest of us lose faith in the system, right? Because we feel like it's in the tank for an elite faction. So unregulated capitalism leads to too much income inequality, and there are political economists who are really concerned about the levels of income inequality. Not capitalism per se, right? But unregulated capitalism. That they would be concerned about the levels of income inequality in the United States being unsustainable if we also want to have a democracy.
This may require a long answer, but how was McCarthyism toppled?
By brave people. I think, yeah, I mean, I think by the kinds of activities that we've just described, where there are people who are, you know, going to continue to show up and say that's not the way it is. You know, people who are going to continue to show up and say that violates democratic norms. People who are going to continue to show up and say that's not my interpretation of the Constitution. I'm going to file a lawsuit, and just continuing to bring pressure. And it might feel slow and painful. I mean, I tell my students, like, as long as you have a right of association, please use it. Right? Like, use it until it's not there anymore, please. To do the kinds of things that put pressure. Yeah, I don't know that I have a better answer than that. Yeah.
So I actually have maybe two questions. I think a lot of young people feel already like the system just is broken and doesn't work. So how do you go about addressing that with them and making them, helping them to not feel like that? And have you noticed any increase with young people in different organizations? Like you were saying, it kind of dropped off in the 60s and 70s. Are we starting to see an increase in people coming back to those organizations or organizations like that?
No.
In a different form?
Yeah, I have a lot of this is like a more accessible version of what I teach across an entire semester to my students. So anytime and we go through and I always start with the erosion of the voluntary associations and the erosion of the public sphere as being the root cause of a lot of it. And then we go through and here's how it was a problem here. But then I always talk about things that you could do to fix it. Like, what are some solutions? Some of which I shared here, others, that are more specific to the class. So I'm giving them a lot of the same information and encouraging them, right, and absolutely they're disillusioned, right? There's polling data right now about young people saying that it's not, everybody freaked out about it, but I was like, well, they don't really mean they don't want to live in a democracy. They mean that they don't think the American democracy. They said it wasn't important, the way they answered the question. A lot of young people said it's not important to live in a democracy anymore. What they meant was, but if you drill down and go, is it important to have free, fair elections? Yes. Is it important to have free speech? Yes. Is it important to have right of association? Yes. But we've taught them that America is the greatest democracy ever, and then you say, is it important to live here? And they're like, maybe not, because I can't get an education, have a family, buy a house. So they are incredibly frustrated, and big chunks of them are very dissatisfied and unhappy. And so basically the conversations I have with them are like, I'm sorry that my generation didn't fix it before you got here. I'm hoping that you will continue to leverage what you have, the tools that you have available to you to fix it and make the system more responsive and address those concerns, and here's how, right? And then every once in a while I have an elderly African-American woman give them a little lecture for me, which is great. Because even if it's hard, right? Even if it's hard, are you gonna stop, right? The one problem that we have, though, is that joining organizations where these skills and identities are learned naturally, right? So that I don't have to backfill so much when they come to college and they don't know that they're supposed to join student organizations. Because it's been generationally so lost that this is a normal, expected thing that you would do. My generation, I was just having a conversation over breakfast. My generation, I'm Gen X, I'm 55. My husband and I remember when, I went to church 3 times a week until I turned 18, so I never stopped going. But my husband remembers, oh yeah, grandma and grandpa were always involved in, his grandpa was a Polish immigrant, the Polish Catholic Men's Organization at the Catholic Church. And, you know, they had the socials in the church in the back, and that's where I learned how to polka. And there was always food at Grandma and Grandpa's house that you couldn't eat because it was for a bake sale or for something social that was happening, right? Like, don't touch it. 3 grandsons that are over 6 foot. Don't touch that. And then he remembers like when his own parents stopped attending things, right? Like there was an erosion of, oh yeah, like around the time I was 10, you know, we stopped going to church. By the time I was 15, we weren't doing, and my parents had stopped doing this, that, and the other. He remembers the erosion. My generation remembers it. The ones that have come up behind me, their parents have never dragged them to any of this stuff. They don't, so they show up, they don't know Robert's rules. They don't know public meeting law. They don't know how to organize a meeting. Like the art of organizing. Everything it took to pull this off. It's not rocket science, and if you give them the opportunities to learn how to do it, and there's still a handful, right? Like there's still SGA on campus. There's still some that are doing it, but it is not culturally the norm. Like it was the norm. We didn't have to like go out and have public relation campaigns to get students to join these clubs and organizations. They understood that this was part of like your education. Like this was part of just what Americans did. And that dropped off considerably by the 1970s, so much so that it was lost generational knowledge. Like when I talk to them about rebuilding the civic infrastructure, rebuilding the public sphere, and they're like, well, where would we, like, how would we do that? And I'm like, well, you could just show up in droves and take over the organization. Like if you had 20 young people show up to your meetings, I'm like, they'd put you in charge of all the committees. They'd be like, oh my God, yay. Right? So like you could just show up and take over the organizations that are here, that you know, the League and Kiwanis and those kinds of things. But also it's not rocket science, right? Like it does take some time and energy, but you know, like getting bylaws together, you know, holding meetings, learning some Robert's rules is doable, right? I'm not asking you to like take extra calculus classes. But we have such a problem with them understanding that that's the efficient, effective way to make things happen in your community, because they're used to doing things online and haven't experienced this. I just paid, I took money out of, I have like a programming budget at Bliss, and I took some money out of my programming budget and I gave it to one of the public relations courses in the communication department on campus, and they did a public relations campaign and developed a whole campaign to persuade other students to join student clubs and organizations. They don't know they're supposed to. They see it as, and legitimately, like when I went to college, I went home and worked as a waitress when I was home for holidays and in the summer. I did not work. And all of my students are working, at least 20 hours a week, usually more. Right? And so they feel like that they don't have time, and they're all taking out student loans, and they're trying to pay rent, and are super stressed financially. And so that when they come up on campus and they go, I could get a part-time job, or I could join this club, a lot of them are taking the part-time or three-quarter-time job to keep the student loan debt down. So they walk away from it. They don't understand how valuable it is and what they can learn. So we're trying to backfill and re-educate them.
I've noticed that the anti-democratic side is much more effective at shaping narratives than the democratic side around things like immigration, reproductive justice. How do we get better at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems is that when you're committed to deliberation and collective action of lots and lots of people, it is hard to be quick and efficient, right? And stay on track with messaging, right? So part of the different decision, like an authoritarian decision-making model, will lead you to be more efficient and effective, sort of top-down, take the talking points and go, as opposed to a deliberative process where that emerges, right, from your meetings and from your organizing and from your action. So it's partly just inherent, but that doesn't mean that we can't help students, you know, or and to find ways to say what they say, repeat their values in an attractive, sort of pithy way. So.
I had a question, also following up on the young people question, is that a lot of the younger folks that I know don't like democracy because it still has a lot of white supremacy culture in it. It's really hard to get in. It has roadblocks around it. And so I've been exploring things like sociocracy and holacracy and things like that, which is consent-based. And we have progressive stack where we ask for the marginalized identities in the room to speak first and things like that, which is why I made the quip about, do we have any women who want to talk? But maybe is there any talk in the academy about rethinking? Like, democracy is not working for everyone right now, and our young people are really feeling that. Is maybe there's something, that kind of conversation going on?
I don't know that we're allowed to have those conversations. So the way that I teach it is from a political science lens, and I talk about how everything that we inherited was built on hierarchy. But also every student in my classroom, male or female, came from some, like, I don't get students at the University of Akron whose ancestors at some point weren't serfs, right? Like, or they wouldn't be at the University of Akron, right? So we talk about, like, okay, at what point did white men without property leverage enough economic power to be disruptive enough to use what, like, the activities that Chenoweth describes to gain, or to gain access, to use the language of the Enlightenment to go, this circle's got to expand to include me. And then at what point did people who were more disenfranchised and had fewer access to status and power, right, with women and minoritized and indigenous, at what point did they use those tactics and broaden? And can you use that as a model, right, for thinking about how to broaden who has access and who is included? So I'm teaching it through the model and the lens of political science. But the other thing that I do is I teach a class, it's still in the books, I teach a class called Women in Politics in the spring. And one of the things that I do is, I say I'm never gonna ask you in an applied politics class to go and participate in politics if I haven't taught you skill sets to be successful. And when women run for office, for example, they're just as likely to win if you control for incumbency and partisanship in the district and things like that. That doesn't mean it's not a harder task, and that you aren't going to face things that men wouldn't. What are some of the things that women face? For example, name calling and shaming, right? Like, you shouldn't be in this race, and then something sexist. So we have them practice name it, shame it, pivot, right? Like, so if you're on a debate stage, you don't want to freeze like Hillary Clinton did. You want to say, I don't think that was a great way to frame your question. That's not what I want to talk about. Maybe you asked me that because I'm a woman. I don't think that that's what I want to talk about. I don't want to talk about who's, like the family, who's raising my kids while I'm running for office. I don't want to answer the question about childcare in my family. I want to talk about why I'm running, and here's X, Y, and Z, and this is, right? It has to be muscle memory for women in the public eye. Because when someone calls you a shocking name or throws an accusation on you, it can feel so shocking and personal that you freeze or you get distracted, go down their rabbit hole and use your message. And I want for my students for it to be a muscle memory. So we practice it, or I have them practice. There was a tactic that was developed in the Obama. Anybody ever been in a meeting and said something and been ignored as a woman? And 10 minutes later, a man says the same thing. And everybody goes, hey, Bob, that's a great idea. And you're like, I just said that, why? Okay, so the women in the Obama White House invented a tactic that they supported each other when it happened to them. And so if I had said something and then you noticed that 10 minutes later, a very similar idea was proposed by a man and had more traction, you would say, thanks, Bob, for circling back to Cherie's idea, right? And I teach them that, right? But those tactics could also work for men from low socioeconomic status. These are effective for everyone. They're just particularly important for women or indigenous or minorities. And so they're good for everyone, but particularly important, right? That I am not encouraging you when I ask women or minorities to run for office in a perfect utopia, right? I know that these sorts of things are gonna happen, and I will do my best to make sure that you're prepared.
They just want you to get your steps in, Renee.
That's right. Thank you.
Senate Bill 1 has been important to this organization. How are you seeing it affect the Bliss Institute and/or future participation in government by students?
Sure, I actually think there's some good, I'll start with the good things first. I really actually don't mind the piece of the legislation that said students are all now required at the college level to have a gen ed with core American documents, right? So that they have to take classes about and read the Declaration and the Constitution and some other, I'm like, more of that is completely fine with me, right? I think that, I don't think it's accurate to say, I did an 8th grade textbook a couple of years ago, I wrote pieces of it. I know it's in there, right? I know that they're being exposed to it, but more is better, especially when the culture of the United States has leaned toward rugged individualism and a selfish culture, right? Like, to be reminded that you will not get to keep these things unless you step up and become a public spirited citizen. Make every single University of Akron student come take that class with me, please. Right? On that piece, I'm completely happy with. I think that the eliminating majors, if you don't have, so there's a piece of the law that says if you don't graduate 5 majors across 3 years, so on average 15 majors across 3 years, Columbus eliminates your major, not your home campus. I understand that, like, we need to phase out through atrophy, maybe, you know, or re-envision what is taught at the university. I think it's short-sighted to put that in that way, because that means, I don't know, philosophy, right? Which is hugely important for the kinds of things, like for Enlightenment political theory, right? And reading John Locke and Montesquieu and all of that stuff. History departments might not, it's not a hugely popular major right now. Might not have that. I don't want to be at a university that doesn't have a philosophy department and colleagues in history. And they teach a huge number of courses in the general education requirement, so they might not be graduating a lot of majors, but they're busy, their classes are full, if you're counting tuition dollars coming to that department, they're fine. So I have problems with that, because I think at a school like Kent or at a school like Akron, we're gonna struggle to keep the humanities and the social sciences, right? Some of the political science at Akron is fine, but some of these other places, you know, that I value and I want my students to take those classes might be at risk. And I think it was just kind of a short-sighted kind of focus on financial security. And then we're still kind of waiting to see how conversation, I mean, it has had an effect, certainly, in terms of diversity programming on campus has been changed a lot. But my book on women in politics, my class on women in politics is still on the books for the spring. And the conversations that we've had with our provost are, and I wouldn't teach this way anyways. I mean, I always say at the beginning of that class, I start with the deep history of patriarchy and what we inherited, right? There's a reason why Ohio was changing its marital rape laws, I don't know, 3 years ago, something like that, to get rid of, right, to add marital rape to the books. Like, there's a reason, right? And so I start with the deep history, but I say how much of a hangover effect this has and how it's affecting women's ability to participate in politics, or what you think appropriate gender roles are. You know, I would ask you to play with the criticism of patriarchy and think critically about it with me throughout the semester. But at the end of the semester, what lives in your head, or your religious values, or your cultural values, are yours, right? And I'm not asking you to change them. I'm just asking you to master the academic material and have conversations with me throughout this class. I don't want to change what anyone thinks or believes or values. And so my provost has said, as long as I've had lots of conservative students. I used to teach at Central Michigan University, where half the students were from small towns and rural areas in Michigan. I've taught that class there. I've had conservative students tell me that they learned a lot in that class and they appreciated taking it. So fingers crossed that the approach that I take will be, will satisfy that I'm giving people space to make their own arguments. I'm giving people space to process information and be critical thinkers and make sense of it in their own way. And as long as we continue to do that, hopefully, cross your fingers, we'll be okay.
We have time for 2 short questions or 1 long question.
Are you willing to opine on the potential outlook for the midterm elections?
Oh, sure, yeah. Polling has been, I will say, and I think I talked about this last year when I was here, I am not doing a lot of polling with my research budget at the University of Akron anymore because I'm really worried about being that woman from Iowa. It's really hard to do good polling right now. People don't have landlines, you can't pull a random sample. They're doing, they're pulling in demographic samples that match the population and weighting them. So all of that being said, there have been well done professional polls that are doing the best they can, that are showing that that the Republican Party is in pretty bad shape as it comes up to the midterms. And then all of the real test of that, right, is voters, right? Like, so you can do all the polls you want, they don't mean anything until after Election Day. But the special elections that we've just seen, I know that the candidate for the Democratic Party did not win in Tennessee, but my gosh, they closed that gap by about 20 points, right? So that was a county a county that went for Trump by 30 points and that narrowed that gap right down, right? To within 10 points. And then winning the special like Spamberger in Virginia and the Cheryl race in New Jersey are all, if I were a Republican consultant or a Republican candidate in any place that looks like it might swing, I would be deeply concerned. And the president's comment about affordability, which is going to be on everybody's talk about the advertising and the micro-targeting, that's when they're going to broadcast. The president saying affordability is a hoax, that comment that was made like 2 weeks ago, is going to be on every Democratic candidate's advertising. And young people in particular can't afford to pay their bills. So I think, I don't know how big this swing will be, but we always expect to push back in the midterms, and I think it's going to be a pretty big one if all of those signs are accurate.
We work locally. It's redundant to say that perhaps, but how do could you give us 3 points to make to convince someone, considering the current, that's all I'll say, the current malaise, just how do you convince people to re-enter? And there are so many Democrats that have not voted, and independents. Portage County is 60 to 70% independent, and I think that translates to no voting. How do you convince people to return to the polls? Like, what are 2, 3 things to say that would make them reinvest in a democracy?
Well, I think the having really the kind of candidate quality that we just saw is helpful. So if you can help, you're going to be, because of the league, you're going to be in touch with people who have the civic skills and the interest, right? Getting really good people to run, who don't have the messaging problem that was asked about, who can give a speech and you know what they're talking about and they can hit the points, that have some of the civic organizing skills so that they can pull together a successful campaign. We just saw with the Cheryl and with the New Jersey and the Virginia gubernatorial races, having really good candidates, right, that can appeal to people. I just read something, it was probably yesterday, I was taking a break from grading. They did exit polls with, it wasn't a huge number, right? They did some exit polls and some focus groups with people who flipped, right? People who voted for Republicans in the last race and voted and flipped for those Democratic candidates in those governor's races and in that special election. and they talked about the candidates and the messaging, the talk that all of them were highlighting affordability, but they also had military backgrounds and were really competent, capable people, and came across as people who would get things done. Like, they're not just going to talk about affordability, like perhaps has happened in the past, but they're actually really going to do something about it. So that really helps. If you're just trying to re-engage people outside of voting, because if they become re-engaged in the league or this kind of organization, they're going to vote, right? Like, the peer pressure alone will be enough to make them vote. And so giving people concrete, productive things that they care about to work on, right? There was just a piece by religion scholars that just came out, like, why have so many people dropped out of religious organizations? Well, one is because it became divisive around gay rights and women's rights and things like that in the 70s. But the other reason more recently is the mega churches don't give people enough to do. People come to church for community and to be active and engaged and involved in things, right, that they care about and have common values. Give them concrete things to do, right? And then they'll keep coming back because they feel like they're making a contribution. And then once they're here, you got them, right? So those high quality candidates, lots of good things to do at the local level will help pull them back in.